Commander Elena Reyes stood at the highest tower of Novathera, her weathered hands gripping the ancient stonework as she surveyed the sprawling valley below. The setting suns cast long shadows across the landscape, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. In another time, she might have found the view beautiful. Today, those shadows seemed to mock her, stretching like dark fingers reaching for her fortress. 3 days had passed since the devastating Battle of the Crimson Plains, where the Vraxian horde had shattered the combined forces of the Terran Defense Alliance. Elena's division had been one of the few to escape the slaughter, though escape felt like too generous a word for what had actually happened. They had fled, scattered to the winds, and she had led her remaining forces to the nearest defensive position, the fortress city of Novathera. Commander, Lieutenant Marcus Rivera's voice broke through her reverie. She turned to face her second-in-command, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the fresh bandage on his left arm. The final headcount is complete. Elena steeled herself. Tell me. 212 personnel, all told. 48 of those are wounded, though most can still fight if needed. He paused, swallowing hard. We have supplies for maybe 2 weeks, if we're careful. 212. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the 6,000 troops under her command just days ago. Each loss was a name, a face, a story cut short by the chitinous claws and plasma weapons of the Vraxian swarm. And our guests? She asked, referring to the civilian population that had sought refuge in the fortress. Just over 300 civilians, mostly local farmers, and their families. They brought some supplies with them, but Marcus trailed off, leaving the implications hanging in the air. Elena nodded, running a hand through her short, graying hair. At 45, she was young for a commander, but right now she felt ancient. What about the Vraxians? Scout drones picked up their advance force about 6 hours ago. Conservative estimates put their numbers at 20,000, with more following. Marcus handed her a datapad showing the drone footage. They're being led by Warlord Kazthar himself. Elena's jaw tightened. Kazthar was known for his brutality, but also for his tactical brilliance. He had earned his reputation by destroying forces much larger than his own through cunning and deception. Now he had both the numbers and the strategic advantage. How long? At their current pace, 4 days. Maybe 5 if we're lucky. Elena turned back to the valley, her mind racing through options, each one more desperate than the last. Novathera was designed to withstand sieges, but it needed a garrison of at least 3,000 to be properly defended. With barely 200 combat-ready troops, they couldn't hope to hold all the defensive positions. She was about to respond when something caught her eye in the command room behind them. In the corner, partially covered by a dust sheet, stood an object that seemed out of place among the military equipment. Elena strode over and pulled away the sheet, revealing an ornate string instrument, similar to the ancient earth instruments she had seen in historical archives. "What is this doing here?" she asked, running her fingers along the intricate woodwork. Marcus checked his datapad. According to the fortress inventory, it's called a theorbo, part of the city's cultural preservation collection. It's some kind of Baroque instrument from old Earth. Elena lifted the instrument carefully, testing its weight. In her youth, before joining the military, she had studied classical music. Those skills had taken a backseat to military strategy over the years, but now, a memory surfaced. A historical account she had read about an ancient Chinese general who had used music and psychological warfare to turn back an overwhelming force. The details were hazy, but the principle. "Marcus," she said slowly, still examining the theorbo, "what do you know about Vraxian cultural responses to human music?" Her lieutenant blinked in surprise. "They find it deeply unsettling. Something about the harmonics affecting their neural patterns. It's why they banned all human musical performances in their occupied territories." A plan began to form in Elena's mind. It was desperate, perhaps even foolish, but they were well past the point where conventional tactics would save them. "Call a meeting of all senior staff," she ordered, carefully placing the Theorbo on the command table. "And find me everything we have on Vraxian psychological warfare studies." "Everything." "Commander." Marcus looked confused. "What are you thinking?" Elena allowed herself a small smile, the first since the disaster at Crimson Plains. "I'm thinking that when you can't win with strength, you have to change the rules of the game. The Vraxians pride themselves on their ability to see through human deception, but perhaps that pride can be turned against them." As Marcus hurried to comply with her orders, Elena plucked one of the Theorbo's strings. The note rang out, clear and strong, echoing off the ancient walls of Novathera. In that moment, she felt something she hadn't since the retreat began. Hope. The Vraxians were coming, yes, but they would find more than just a desperate last stand waiting for them. They would find a symphony of deception, conducted by a commander who had nothing left to lose. The ancient halls of Novathera buzzed with frantic activity as Commander Elena Reyes' unconventional plan took shape. Soldiers who had expected to spend their final days manning defensive positions instead found themselves arranging elaborate light displays and setting up sonic projectors salvaged from the fortress's ancient warning system. In the central courtyard, Elena sat with the Theorbo, her fingers moving across the strings with growing confidence as she reacquainted herself with the forgotten skills of her youth. The instrument's deep, resonant tones echoed off the stone walls, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that even her own troops found unsettling. "The sonic mapping is complete, Commander," reported Lieutenant Rivera, approaching with a holographic display of the fortress. "We've identified the key resonance points, where the acoustics will carry the sound furthest into the valley." Elena nodded, studying the glowing points on the map. "And the amplification system. Chief Engineer Patel says it'll work, but she's never attempted anything like this before. We're essentially turning the entire fortress into one massive speaker." "Show me what else we've accomplished," Elena said, carefully setting aside the Theorbo. They walked the fortress walls together, reviewing the various elements of their desperate gambit. Every available power cell had been redirected to their deception. Holographic projectors, salvaged from damaged combat suits, created phantom movements along the battlements. Maintenance drones, reprogrammed by their tech team, carried lights in complex patterns during the night hours, suggesting troop movements that didn't exist. At the eastern wall, they found Technical Sergeant Yuki Tanaka working with a team to modify the fortress's ancient sonic defense system. Originally designed to emit warning blasts during attacks, they were now being tuned to resonate with Elena's music. "The harmonics are aligned, Commander," Yuki reported, her hands covered in grease and circuitry burns. "When you play, the whole city will sing with you. Though I should mention," she hesitated, "the power drain is massive. Once we start, we won't be able to stop and restart without depleting our emergency reserves. Then we'll have to get it right the first time," Elena replied, her voice firm despite the knot forming in her stomach. As they completed their inspection, a young scout burst into the courtyard. "Commander, the Vraxian advance force has entered the valley. They're moving faster than expected." Elena rushed to the observation post, raising her binoculars to study the distant dust clouds. The massive forms of Vraxian war beasts could be seen even at this distance, their chitinous armor gleaming in the sunlight. Above them, scout drones buzzed like angry insects. "Time estimate?" she asked, not lowering the binoculars. "At their current pace, they'll be in position by nightfall tomorrow." Elena lowered the binoculars slowly, her mind racing. They weren't ready. The original plan had called for at least another day of preparation, but the Vraxians had moved faster than their intelligence suggested possible. "Commander," Marcus spoke softly, "we could still try to evacuate the civilians through the underground tunnels. There's a chance some might make it." Elena shook her head. "The Vraxians will be watching for that. Their bioforms can sense movement underground better than our best motion trackers. We'd be sending them to their deaths." She turned to face her assembled officers. "We proceed as planned, but we accelerate everything. I want all preparations complete by sunset today." As her officers hurried to comply, Alina returned to the theorbo. Her fingers were bleeding slightly from hours of practice, but she ignored the pain. The next few hours would determine whether her plan was a stroke of genius or the final mistake of a desperate commander. Throughout the afternoon, the fortress transformed. Civilians were positioned strategically near windows and battlements, given specific times to move past them with lights, creating the illusion of massive troop movements. The few combat-capable soldiers they had were spread thin, each responsible for maintaining multiple deceptions. As the sun began to set, Alina stood before her assembled forces in the great hall. Looking at their faces, some determined, others scared, all exhausted, she felt the weight of command more heavily than ever before. "What we attempt today has never been done," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "We face an enemy that outnumbers us 100 to 1, led by one of their most cunning warlords. They expect to find a weakened force ready for slaughter. Instead, they will find uncertainty, mystery, and fear." She lifted the theorbo, its polished wood gleaming in the torchlight. The Vraxians pride themselves on seeing through human deception. We will turn that pride against them. Every shadow will hide an army. Every echo will speak of strength we do not possess. Every note will plant a seed of doubt in their minds. Through the windows, they could see the dust clouds growing closer, the enemy's advance guard now clearly visible in the valley below. "To your positions," Alina commanded. "Remember your timing. Remember your movements. And most importantly, remember this. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one you wield, but the one your enemy thinks you might have." As her people dispersed to their assigned posts, Alina climbed the steps to the highest tower of Novathera. The modified sonic projectors hummed with power, waiting for her signal. In the valley below, the first elements of the Vraxian horde were setting up their siege positions. Alina settled into position, the theorbo ready in her hands. Sunset was minutes away. Soon, she would play the first notes of what she hoped would be the symphony that saved her people, or their final requiem. Warlord Kazthar stood at the edge of his command pavilion, his massive form casting long shadows in the light of Novathera's twin moons. His outer carapace, scarred from countless battles, reflected the strange lights emanating from the fortress before him. Something was wrong. He had expected to find a broken enemy, a desperate handful of survivors from the rout at Crimson Plains. Instead, he found this. The first notes had begun at sunset, carrying across the valley with impossible clarity. His warriors had frozen at the sound, their antennae vibrating with ancestral warnings of danger. The music was unlike anything they had encountered in their campaigns against the humans. Deep, resonant tones that seemed to bypass their auditory membranes and strike directly at their neural cores. "Report," he chittered to his chief strategist, Vextal, who approached with several data crystals clutched in his secondary limbs. "The situation is unclear, Warlord," Vextal began, his mandibles clicking nervously. "Our bioscanners are showing contradictory readings. We detect massive movement within the fortress, suggesting a garrison of at least 5,000, but the energy signatures don't align with these numbers." Kazthar's compound eyes narrowed. "Explain." "The power distribution throughout the fortress is erratic. Some sections show massive energy usage, others appear completely dead. And there's something else." Vextal hesitated. The sonic patterns we're detecting. They're not simply music. They're interfering with our short-range scanning capabilities. From the fortress walls, another melody began, this one higher, weaving through the deeper notes in a complex pattern that set Kazthar's wing cases vibrating uncomfortably. Along the battlements, shadows moved in precise formations, suggesting well-coordinated troop movements. "Impossible," Kazthar snarled. "We destroyed their army at Crimson Plains. I saw their forces scattered, their command structure in ruins. Commander Rice fled with barely 200 survivors. Yet our forward scouts report defensive preparations consistent with a much larger force." Vextal countered carefully. "The pattern of movement suggests at least 3 full battalions, possibly more in reserve. And there's something about their deployment that seems familiar. Casvar moved to the tactical display, studying the holographic representation of Novathera. The movements they were detecting. Yes, he could see it now. The patterns were eerily similar to those used by the legendary human general Augustus Drake during the Battle of New Gibraltar, where he had turned back a Vraxian force 3 times his size through brilliant defensive positioning. But Drake had died 50 years ago. His tactics were studied by both sides, documented, analyzed. A cold feeling settled in Casvar's thorax. Commander Reyes had served under Drake's protege early in her career. "My lord," a scout burst into the pavilion, its carapace dusty from the field. "We've detected unusual energy signatures from the fortress's lower levels. They match the profiles of human quantum arsenals." Quantum arsenals, the deadliest weapons in the human arsenal, capable of tearing apart the fabric of space itself. They had been banned by both sides after the devastation of the Proxima campaign. If Reyes had access to such weapons, the music changed again, taking on a martial quality that seemed to mock them. Casvar watched as lights moved through the fortress in complex patterns, suggesting the movement of heavy equipment. But the energy readings still didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. "Your orders, Warlord?" Vextal asked, his antennae twitching as another wave of sonic resonance washed over them. Casvar remained silent, studying the fortress. In all his years of warfare against the humans, he had learned to fear their capacity for deception. But he had also learned to trust his instincts. And right now, every fiber of his being was screaming that something was wrong. "Pull the advance forces back 2 kilometers, he finally ordered. "I want deep scan probes deployed in a full perimeter. No unit is to approach the fortress walls until we understand what we're facing." "But Warlord," one of his sub-commanders protested, "our forces vastly outnumber." "Did you learn nothing from Crimson Plains?" Casvar cut him off sharply. "We won that battle because we drew them into attacking on our terms. Commander Reyes is many things, but she has never been one to make the same mistake twice." As if in response to his words, the music from the fortress swelled to a crescendo, and new lights appeared along the walls. Strange, shifting patterns that their sensors couldn't properly analyze. Casvar watched as his warriors unconsciously stepped back, their natural instincts responding to something their rational minds couldn't comprehend. In his thousands of battles against humanity, Casvar had learned that the most dangerous human was not the one who fought with strength, but the one who fought with their mind. And right now, his mind was telling him that Elena Reyes, the commander he had thought broken and defeated, was playing a game whose rules he did not yet understand. Dawn broke over Novathera, painting the fortress walls in shades of gold and amber. Commander Elena Reyes hadn't slept, her fingers moving across the Theorbos strings with mechanical precision as she maintained the complex sonic deception that had kept the Vraxian forces at bay through the night. Her shoulders ached, and her fingertips had gone numb hours ago, but she dared not stop. "Status report," she whispered to Lieutenant Rivera, who kept a constant vigil beside her. "The Vraxians have pulled back their forward elements," he reported, studying the tactical display. "They're deploying some kind of advanced scanning equipment, trying to see through our deception. Chief Engineer Patel says our countermeasures are holding, but—" He hesitated. "A power grid is starting to show strain. We've got maybe 12 hours before systems start failing." Elena nodded, never missing a note in the complex melody she was weaving. "And our people?" "Exhausted, but holding. The civilians are maintaining their movement patterns perfectly. Even the children understand what's at stake." Below them, in the fortress courtyard, Elena could see the carefully choreographed dance continuing. Civilians moved with precise timing, carrying reflective panels that caught the morning light in ways that confused Praxian biosensors. Soldiers in partial power armor made the rounds, each one programmed to emit energy signatures that mimicked multiple troops. "New development," Marcus said suddenly, his voice tense. "They're deploying sonic probes, trying to map our internal structure using sound waves. Elena allowed herself a small smile, never breaking rhythm. Exactly as expected. Signal Surgeon Tanaka. Across the fortress, hidden speakers began emitting subsonic frequencies that they had discovered by accident during their preparations. The frequencies, while harmless to humans, created phantom readings in Vraxian sensing organs. To their bioscanners, it would appear as if the fortress's internal structure was constantly shifting, making any accurate mapping impossible. Commander. A young soldier burst onto the tower platform, nearly dropping her tablet in her haste. We're picking up communications from the Vraxian command post. They're requesting parley. Elena's fingers finally stilled on the theorbo's strings, the last note hanging in the air like a question. This was the moment of greatest danger and greatest opportunity. Everything hinged on what happened next. Patch it through, she ordered, lifting a communicator to her ear. The harsh, clicking sounds of the Vraxian language filled the channel, automatically translating into her neural implant. Commander Reyes. Warlord Kazthar's voice carried a mix of respect and suspicion. I must admit, you have presented us with quite a puzzle. Have I? Elena kept her voice steady, professional. I merely stand ready to defend this position, as any commander would. Indeed. A pause. Your tactical deployment is fascinating, almost identical to General Drake's defense of New Gibraltar. I studied that battle extensively. Did you know I faced Drake once, early in my career? Elena's heart raced, but she maintained her calm tone. I was not aware. Yes, he taught me a valuable lesson about human deception, about how your kind can turn weakness into strength through cunning. Another pause. I'm curious, Commander. What would my scanner show if we launched a full biological sweep of your fortress right now? You're welcome to try, Elena replied, allowing a note of amusement to enter her voice. Though I should warn you, the last 3 probes that attempted deep scans suffered rather catastrophic failures. Something about the resonance frequencies we're generating. She gestured to her officers, who immediately began implementing the next phase of their plan. Across the fortress, carefully hidden devices activated, creating electromagnetic disturbances that would play havoc with Vraxian scanning technology. Ah yes, the music. Kazthar's tone changed slightly, a remarkable choice of weapon. It reminds me of ancient tales from my people's history, of sonic weapons that could shatter minds as easily as they shattered walls. Elena picked up the theorbo again, letting her fingers drift across the strings in a seemingly casual pattern. Through her neural link, she could see the Vraxian bio-readings spike as the new harmonics reached their lines. Stories can be powerful things, she said softly. They shape how we think, how we act, what we believe is possible. Her fingers moved faster, adding layers of complexity to the melody. For instance, there are stories about this fortress, about what lies in its deepest vaults, sealed away since the last war. Through her tactical display, Elena watched as the Vraxian forces shifted uncomfortably, their natural hierarchical formations showing signs of stress as the combination of music, electromagnetic interference, and carefully staged movements continued to feed their growing uncertainty. You're playing a dangerous game, Commander, Kazthar warned, though she could hear the doubt in his voice. Am I playing a game, Warlord? Elena stood, walking to the edge of the tower where she knew their long-range scanners could clearly see her. Or am I simply standing ready to defend this fortress with every weapon at my disposal? The question you should be asking yourself is, can you afford to guess wrong? The silence that followed was broken only by the haunting notes of the theorbo, echoing across the valley like a challenge. Elena held her breath, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether her desperate gambit would succeed or fail. In the distance, the Vraxian army stirred like a disturbed hive, waiting for their leader's decision. The dance of deception had reached its final movement. Now everything depended on whether the seeds of doubt they had planted would bloom into the salvation they so desperately needed. The third sunset since the standoff began painted Novathera's walls in blood-red hues. Commander Elena Reyes stood at her post, the Theorbo held close as she watched the Vraxian forces through her tactical display. For 72 hours, they had maintained their elaborate deception, each note and movement precisely calculated to feed the enemy's growing paranoia. But they were reaching their limits. The power grid was failing sector by sector, their jerry-rigged systems pushed far beyond their design specifications. In the lower levels, Engineer Patel and her team worked frantically to reroute what little power remained to maintain their vital systems. The civilians who had performed so admirably in their roles were exhausted, their movements becoming less precise with each passing hour. "We can't maintain this much longer," Lieutenant Rivera reported, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "The sonic projectors in sectors 3 and 7 are already offline. If we lose any more, the whole illusion could collapse." Elena nodded, her fingers never stopping their dance across the strings. "How many of the Vraxian forces have withdrawn?" "Almost a third of their army has pulled back to their secondary positions, but Kazthar still has more than enough troops to overwhelm us if he commits to an assault." A sudden burst of static came through their communication system. "Commander," Sergeant Tanaka's voice was urgent. "We're detecting massive energy signatures from the Vraxian lines. They're powering up their siege engines." Belena's hands finally stilled on the Theorbo. This was it, the moment of truth. Either Kazthar had seen through their deception and was preparing for a final assault, or "Incoming transmission," Marcus announced. "It's Kazthar." Elena took a deep breath, composing herself before activating the comlink. "This is Commander Reyes." "A masterful performance, Commander." Kazthar's voice carried an odd mix of emotions, respect, frustration, and something that might have been amusement. "I spent 3 days analyzing every possibility, every scenario. Your deployment patterns suggest a force of at least 5,000. Your energy signatures indicate advanced weapons that shouldn't exist. And that music," he chittered softly, "it stirs memories our kind would rather forget." Elena remained silent, letting the tension build. "But there's something else," Kazthar continued. "Something that's been bothering me since the first night. Do you know what it is?" "Enlighten me," Elena replied, her hand tightening on the Theorbo. "It's too perfect." The Vraxian warlord's voice hardened. "Every movement, every signal, every note. It's all precisely calculated to prey on our species' deepest instincts and tactical doctrines. No real military force moves with such artificial precision. You've orchestrated a magnificent illusion, Commander Reyes, but in its very perfection, it reveals itself as just that, an illusion." Elena's heart nearly stopped, but she kept her voice steady. "An interesting theory, Warlord. Are you willing to bet 20,000 lives on it?" "Ah, but that's the true brilliance of your strategy, isn't it?" Kazthar actually laughed, a sound like grinding stones. "Even knowing it's a deception, I cannot be certain what other surprises you might have prepared. The risk of being wrong, of leading my forces into some carefully prepared trap." He paused. "The cost would be too high." Through her tactical display, Elena watched as the Vraxian siege engines powered down. Across their lines, troops began to fall back in perfect formation. "I'm withdrawing my forces from the valley," Kazthar announced. "You've won this round, Commander. But remember, deceptions, no matter how clever, cannot be maintained forever. When next we meet, it will be on an open field of battle." "Perhaps," Elena replied softly. "Or perhaps you'll find that the music of humanity has more movements than you expect." The communication channel closed with a final burst of static. Elena watched as the massive Vraxian army began its retreat, their formations dissolving into the gathering darkness like morning mist. Only when their rear guard had disappeared beyond the valley's edge did she finally allow her hands to tremble. "Stand down defensive positions," she ordered, her voice barely a whisper. Power down all non-essential systems and get our people some rest. They've earned it. As her officers rushed to comply, Elena remained at her post, the Theorbo still cradled in her arms. In the courtyard below, she could hear the sounds of celebration beginning to build as word of their salvation spread through the fortress. But Elena's mind was already racing ahead, planning their next moves. They had survived, yes, but Kazthar was right about one thing. Deceptions couldn't last forever. Yet they had proven something important here, something that would echo through future battles. In the endless dance between species, between civilizations, the most powerful weapons were not always those that could destroy bodies, but those that could touch minds and hearts. Elena plucked one final note from the Theorbo, letting it ring out across the now empty valley. The note hung in the air like a promise, or perhaps a warning, a reminder that humanity's greatest strength lay not in its armies or its weapons, but in its ability to turn imagination into reality, to weave dreams into weapons, and to find hope in the darkest of nights. As the last echoes faded, Elena finally allowed herself to smile. They had written a new chapter in the eternal story of survival, not with bullets or bombs, but with music and mystery. And somewhere out there, a Vraxian warlord was learning that sometimes the most dangerous human weapon was not the one you could see, but the one that lived in your own doubts and fears. The melody of deception had played its final note, but the symphony of war would play on. And when it did, humanity would be ready with new songs to sing.